Tennessee linebacker Elijah Herring officially in the transfer portal. He'd announced he was going to be in, but then he wasn't officially in the portal, but now he is there. That and more coming up right here with Eric Cain of Locked On Vols. How big of a loss is this for Tennessee?
You know, he was their leading tackler last year. So you look on paper, you're looking from afar, it's like, oh man, huge loss for Tennessee, leading tackler. And I'm not trying to minimize that. I mean, I like Elijah Herring. I think he's a bright young player. But he's got his limitations for sure. He is a in-the-box run player, downhill guy. Screams Big Ten, right? I mean, it feels like a Big Ten player. But, you know, when he's outside of the box, and, you know, that's kind of the way the game, a lot of areas are going, you know, in the SEC, spread things out, multiple receivers. He certainly, you know, has a long way to go in terms of improvement. But again, he's got a lot of intangibles. He was forced into a starting role when Keenan Peely went out this past year, very prematurely, but Tennessee didn't have an option. But he got better and better as the year went on. So Tennessee didn't want to lose him per se, but you do have Keenan Peely, Arian Carter, Jeremiah Thielander, Edwin Spillman. I mean, you got a lot of linebackers ready to roll, so it's not an absolutely devastating loss, if that makes sense. He has a younger brother, Caleb Herring, who's a Leo, who's an edge player, and they're very close. So honestly, with this one, he announced on Monday that he was going to the portal. He didn't officially get into the portal until Thursday. If he were to take his name out of the portal, wouldn't shock me at all with this one, because again, little brother's still on campus, and Caleb Herring, and at this time, he's not going anywhere.
Yeah, and he's someone who can be a plug-and-play starter, and the production is proven at Tennessee. That can be, you know, what a lot of teams are really seeking in the transfer portals. Hey, we want someone who comes in, fills a need right now, can start right away, will pick up a defensive system pretty quickly. He's reportedly had contact with Colorado, and that's no surprise because Deion Sanders and the transfer portal go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're always together, it seems, and they're very rarely seen as being apart there. Demoy Kennedy went into the transfer portal. He was a former 5-star once at Alabama. He went to Colorado. It didn't work out there, so he's in the portal. That's a linebacker that's available, but you know, if Herring were to wind up with the Buffs, I'd have to think that's a guy who steps in and starts right away, and that fit makes a lot of sense given that Kennedy just left Colorado.
Yeah, and I mean, Elijah Herring, again, he's bright, he's smart, he's hungry. I think it would fit in more with that play style in the conference. Would make a whole lot of sense. And, again, he's a guy that, I mean, it's not like he's bad. He's very productive. He had 80 tackles in 13 games last year. Played both Mike and Will. Again, has experience playing outside the box a little bit. His role as a freshman last year was coming off the edge there in pass rushing situations. So he's got a little bit well-rounded part of his game, if you will. But I think if he were to visit, like, and commit to Colorado, would make a whole lot of sense, and I think he would be an immediate impact player for Deion.
Yeah, when you say run-stuffing linebacker, that screams Big Ten, especially when you look at the lineup of quarterbacks in the Big Ten this year. It's not a very impressive list. I mean, we had Jay Stevens of Locked On Buckeyes on the show recently talking about how Will Howard might not even be the starter at Ohio State, which has been an assumption for a long time, but that doesn't look to be, you know, set in stone. You've got Dylan Gabriel at Oregon. You've got Drew Aller at Penn State. Those are the only, you know, high-end or above-average known commodities you've got over there, so certainly that could be a fit for Elijah Herring. But take a look at the big picture for Tennessee in the transfer portal right now. They've been pretty quiet in Knoxville, both on the additions front and on the departures front. What does that mean for Tennessee football at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing. You know, Elijah Herring really, to this point, has been the only one that has announced intentions of entering the transfer portal or anything like that. I think that there are some guys that we kind of expected that might look around and maybe go. But remember, at this point, until it's petitioned in court, and they changed that as well, in the SEC, in this window, if you enter the portal, you can't go to another SEC school. So you're kind of limited a little bit, right? But I think it also shows that, hey, these guys like being on this team. These guys like being a part of this locker room and this culture with Josh Heupel, the staff that they've created, and kind of know that, you know, Tennessee's kind of on the brink right now. You're kind of in that conversation of, hey, with 12-team playoffs, man, you can push and have a chance to go win a national title, and you kind of go on a run here and you win a couple of games. Maybe you can be in Atlanta and playing for an SEC championship, and the belief around quarterback Nico Iamaleava. So I think it's all that kind of stuff, and I think it's a good thing because I think this roster is pretty good. But I will say this: you're one twisted ankle away at running back from being a real issue here. You got Dylan Sampson, who's your starter. He's good. Cam Seldon, your backup, is out with an injury, and he might be out until about midway through September. We don't know. After that, you have a whole lot of inexperience and a whole lot of unknowns. And so going and getting a running back in the transfer portal, and they're evaluating that right now, would make a whole lot of sense. However, going and paying $400,000, $500,000 for a third-string running back makes no sense. So if they are going to take a guy, I think it would be a running back, but it would have to make a whole lot of sense, multi-year, and you can't rock the boat. I mean, I don't know what Dylan Sampson's making in name, image, and likeness, but I would imagine you can't go out and get this guy and pay him more to come and play behind him. You know what I'm saying? It's the new era of college athletics that you got to kind of be aware of.
Well, and it's a complicated spot to be in when you're trying to fill a reserve role, because typically guys go into the portal because they want to seek more playing time, right? And so, to use an example that I'm familiar with, Jay Harris transferred to Oregon and could be, is the third or fourth string running back going into this year. He transferred from Division II Northwest Missouri State. It's pretty rare that you can find a transfer third string running back who'd be willing to come in and, have that sort of role, which is going to be limited, because typically a guy is leaving because he is a third string elsewhere or a fourth string and he's further down the depth chart. And, going to spend NIL dollars for someone that could fill in if an injury takes place, it might not feel like an efficient use of dollars for the collective and whatnot. So I think that's kind of a tricky spot to be in. And you talked about the depth chart there for Tennessee and kind of how that could make sense. A name that comes to mind is Colorado running back Alton McCaskill, a guy who might have been a top two at Colorado had he stayed, but he goes into the portal instead, hasn't played a lot the last couple of years. But other than that, every running back I see going in the portal, I think is probably going to go somewhere with the intention of being, at worst, the number 2 back.
Yeah, and I mean, Tennessee's got Nico at quarterback, and last year they had Joe Milton at quarterback and Nico, and then those were really the only 2 scholarship quarterbacks on roster. This year you got 3 scholarship quarterbacks, but the fans have been saying, well, go get a body out of the portal, right? Just go get a quarterback out of the portal to make sure if Nico gets hurt that Tennessee's going to be okay. As Jake Marklinger comes along as a true freshman. But to your point, what you're just saying, it's like, hey, how many quarterbacks want to say, oh yeah, I'll come to Knoxville and I'll sit behind Nico Iamaleava and I won't play at all, but I'll come, sign me up. It's not very appealing, right? I mean, there's not a lot of guys in the transfer portal that want to do that. So again, I think the transfer portal is great in so many different ways. Like, you can help your roster, guys can go and get new opportunities and all that, but also it's just not as easy as, oh, that guy hit the portal, let's go grab him and throw him to my roster on Madden or NCAA. It just doesn't work like that a lot of times. So I think we're kind of going through that in the running back situation now. Like, sure, Tennessee needs a running back. I agree. Will it get one from this portal window? I don't know, because there's just, again, so many different factors.
Yeah, do you like where Tennessee's roster is at with the lack of portal moves here? Like, is there any other position that you look at? Let's say Elijah Herring does end up leaving the Vols for 2024. Is there any position group where you say, okay, maybe a transfer or starting caliber player would be better at this particular spot? Or do you feel like the Vols are set with, a top 4 or 5 roster in the SEC?
I mean, you can always improve. Don't get me wrong. You can always get better. But, I mean, I like this roster. I mean, Tennessee completely started over in the secondary. All 5 of your starters in the secondary last year have either graduated, out of eligibility, or transferred. So you're starting from fresh, and you went out and got Jamal McCoy, who I know you're very familiar with at cornerback, and Jacoby Thomas from MTSU coming up, and Jalen McMurray from Temple, and you added those guys to the mix. You brought up some young guys, and sure, like maybe a defensive back if one's available. But as far as linebackers, I like the option. Tennessee's defensive line, you've got probably the deepest defensive line in the nation, so you're good there. Offensive line, you got to figure out who's going to be your left guard, but there were so many guys who were injured this spring that you never really got to look at that true competition. So if one's available and has multiple years and makes sense, sure, go get them. But outside of that, you're pretty good at guard and some of the young guys that got a lot of work this year. Quarterback, you're good, and of course that brings us back to wide receiver. You're great, and brings us back to running back. So yeah, I mean, I think I like this roster. I do. I think this is a roster that is not perfect. It's got some limitations for sure, but again, it's got the makings of being a really solid football team, whereas the rosters that have been here for Josh Heupel when he took over a couple years ago, man, you were kind of in survival mode. You're not in survival mode anymore. You're in attack mode and like, hey, let's go get this dub mode and let's go be one of the best teams in the SEC. That's kind of where your roster is right now. So the lack of movement so far, not a surprise, because you don't have to go and just take a guy like you had to in years past.
The latest in Knoxville, Eric Cain, Locked On Vols on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Eric, thanks for stopping by.
Hey, thanks so much.
What does Florida need to accomplish right now? That's coming up next.